So now we can validate and also reset the form. Of course, one crucial thing is missing though, and that's submitting or saving the form. And we can of course also do that. Now to save the form and get access to the entered values, we can again use the form key and there the current state, and then call the save method. Now when calling the save method, a special function will be triggered on all these form field widgets inside the form, like this text form field. The special function that will be triggered is the onSaved function. So a function you pass to the onSaved parameter value. Now onSaved is a function that receives the value that was entered as an argument, and this will be the value at the point of time save is executed. And then in here you can do with that value whatever you want. For example, to get access to it and use it along with all the other form values that have been entered, you can add a new variable here. And that could be the entered name, which initially is an empty string, let's say. And you can set this entered name to a new value, the currently set value, inside of this onSaved function like this. Now here we must add an exclamation mark to make it clear that value will not be null. Alternatively, you could also add an extra check and, for example, return if value should be null. In that case, this code would not execute. But this is redundant and not needed here because we already have our validation logic where we check if value is null. Therefore, we should only call that save method if validation fails. And to make sure that that's the case, we can wrap this validate call here into an if statement. So use it as a condition in an if statement, because as mentioned before, validate returns a boolean and it returns true if validation succeeds and false otherwise. And then we can move this save method call here into this if statement so that we only run this code if validate returns true, which as mentioned will only be the case if validation succeeds. Therefore, we'll then also know that in all our onSaved functions like this one here, the value will be valid because otherwise we wouldn't call save and this onSaved function here wouldn't get called. That's why we know with certainty that value here will not be null. We also don't need to wrap this with setState here because actually I don't need the build method to execute again. I don't have any UI update that should be performed because of that. I just want to store the value in a property of my class here, because that then allows me to use that property here after calling save. For example, to print the entered name. And here you will see that this will print the value that has been entered, because it's set here by calling save, because that executes this onSaved function where we do set the value, and therefore in the next line thereafter, entered name will be available. Hence, if I save this and reload, you will see that if I go back here and I enter test and I click add item, if I then take a look at my debug console, I see my value here. And that's how you can get safe access to the entered values. Now, of course, we can repeat this for the entered quantity, but here I want to get a number and I'll have an initial value of 1. And we can now use this quantity to set the initial value. We'll just have to make sure that we call toString to convert this to a string. But even more importantly, we can then also use it to store the entered value once save is called. For that, we add onSaved here as well to this second text form field, the quantity text form field. And we get our value here, but this value will be a string. It always is. The text fields always want and yield strings. Since entered quantity wants a number, we therefore must convert this value to a number by using int, and then here we can use parse and parse the value. The difference between parse and try parse is that parse will throw an error if it fails to convert the string to a number, whereas try parse yields null. But since we already check whether try parse yields null here in our validator, we can safely use parse here because, as mentioned before, onSaved, this function here, will only execute if validation succeeded. Otherwise, we would not call save here in our save item method. Therefore, it should be safe to use parse here, and we also know that value won't be null, hence we can add this exclamation mark, because we also check for this in our validator. And with that, we're also setting the entered quantity. Now, what about the drop-down button form field? Indeed, there we do have an onSaved method, but here we'll have to manage the selected value manually anyways. Also to make sure that an initial value is shown. Because drop-down button form field doesn't support an initial value parameter, instead it just has a value parameter, which must be updated every time the selection changes though, so that what we see on the UI is in line with what's stored internally. Therefore here, as we did it earlier in the course in another section, we have to add a new variable, for example selected category, and we can set this to an initial value like categories, using this categories list here from categories Dart. And then there the category with an identifier of categories.vegetable. And for that we have to make sure that we select it like this and automatically add the import to the category Dart file here from the models folder. And then here we should also add an exclamation mark, because otherwise Dart thinks that this here could be null, but we know that it will never be null because we know that a category with this identifier does exist in this categories list. This then also helps Dart infer that selected category will be of type category. And now we can update selected category whenever the selected drop-down value changes. This can be done with help of onChanged, which is triggered whenever a new selection is made. And here we get the selected value as an input automatically by Flutter. And therefore here we can set selected value equal to value. And here we should also add an exclamation mark to make it clear that this will never be null. And to make sure that this is never null, we should also set value to selected category. So that initially it's this category here, and therefore we do have an initial non-null value, and thereafter it won't be possible to select nothing anyways. You have to select something in that list, so value should never be null therefore. That's why we can then update selected category, but here we also need to call setState and make sure that the build method is executed again. This is required because selected category is used to set the currently visible value, and of course that should stay in sync with what we selected in the dropdown and should update whenever we change our selection, so that the currently selected value is reflected on the screen. That's why setState is needed here. But with that we're also storing the selected category, and that's also why we don't need to add onSaved here, even though we could, because we are already storing the selected value and we are updating it whenever the selection changes. So there's no need to implement the onSaved function on this drop-down button form field. And therefore here, ultimately, we got all the values we need. We can now print entered name, entered quantity, and also print the selected category. And if we do all that, and save that and force a reload, you will see that if you go here and you enter something and maybe select dairy and then click add item, nothing happens here yet. Of course, this will also change later. But if we take a look at the debug console, there we do indeed see the values we just selected.